So before we do any presentation at Royal Roads, we always acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and the Kwangan ancestors and families. And learning has been happening at Royal Roads for countless generations. We're so grateful to be on this land. And we are here today. I'll go to the next slide, to discuss the unmasking of the pandemic. So we're going to be having a panel discussion about how masks have been serving as a visual metaphor for COVID-19. So I am joined by wonderful panelists from the School of Communication and Culture. So we have Zhenyi Li, who is the school director as well as a professor within the School of Communication and Culture. We have Michelle Tsutsumi, who is a student in the Masters of Professional Communication program. We have Chaseten Remillard, who is a professor and program head for the School of Communication and Culture, specifically for the Bachelor of Professional Communication. And then we have Olaolu Adeleye, who is an associate faculty within the School of Communication and Culture. And from there, I'm going to hand it over to you, Chaseten, to take us through what we're going to be going through today.
Thanks, Elena. So, I mean, it's really great to be here and excited to see that there's interest in this topic, and more as we prepared for this, we realized that masks are becoming even more and more of a hot topic politically in all kinds of different ways. So I'm going to run us through a little bit of the context of how we came to this project and sort of what led us to this presentation right now. We'll have an opportunity for each of the co-authors to run us through sort of the main themes of their work that we included in our publication. Then we'll have a open space or a question and answer period where we would really like to hear from you and have a dialogue with you about your experiences of the pandemic and of masks and what your thoughts are on those issues and ideas. And then we'll finish with what we're calling considerations, and I'll make a little mention of what that is in my discussion about how the project came about and why we don't have, let's say, traditional conclusions as you would in other academic papers. So let's start with the iterative project. So we were approached with a call for papers from a couple of professors down in the States who were putting together a collection of scholarship in what's going to be published as two books, 2-volume books. And we responded and we said, you know, what we would be very interested in is discussing masks as a sort of visual form of communication around the pandemic. And so we gathered, the four of us as authors gathered, and we started to talk about what would that project be. And we first envisioned the project as being much more social scientific and in the scientific point of view. And so we were going to collect a bunch of images from media. We were going to see whether or not there were what kinds of images of masks had been put out there into the public sphere. And we were going to do some kind of quantitative content analysis and sort of put everything together. And that was going to be our project. And as we sat down, in Zoom, and this was sort of early on in the pandemic, I think we first started meeting in March, end of March, we just started sharing our stories about our experiences seeing people wear masks, our cultural, our cultural histories and our understandings of masks, our sort of personal narratives around masks, and how this pandemic was really impacting us. And we were really just being very human about it. And we had, admittedly, for me anyways, probably one of the best research experiences that I've had collaboratively with the three other folks here. And we just really shared a lot of sort of interesting ideas. And so we completely retooled our idea of what our paper should be or our research should be. And we looked for a methodology, and that's not typically what you do as a researcher is first go to, first come up with an idea and then go to a methodology. But we went and we looked for a methodology that might allow us to be more creative, more focus more on our own personal stories. And we came across collaborative ethnography. And collaborative ethnography is really a process by which authors share their own positioned stories. They speak from their own, the data that you use, if you like, is your own personal experience. And so we really focused on each of our experiences with the pandemic, and how that, through the lens, if you like, or through, as we call it, the metaphor of the mask, and how we've sort of changed our understanding of what the mask is, and our understanding of how that fits into our own sort of personal research, our interests, and personal backgrounds, and so on. And at the end of that, because collaborative ethnography is really about engagement, and it's about a leveling of narratives, so everyone's narrative is the same and everyone's story is the same, we decided not to end with conclusions, and rather we ended with considerations as an invitation for people, hopefully, to take our research and to reflect on their own experience, and sort of to maybe gain insight into their own experience, and to sort of know more fully their own experience, and to also be aware of the different perspectives of wearing masks and the pandemic from a variety of different perspectives. And so that's our hope, and that's why we have quite a bit of time scheduled for the sort of open space, as we're calling it, or the Q&As, because we really are interested in the stories of this, and we've really enjoyed thinking through that. And I'll just give a very brief introduction to each of the vignettes, as we're calling it. So the chapter has 4 separate stories, or 4 separate narratives, if you like. The first is Zhenyi's, and in his vignette, he speaks about community, he speaks about culture, and he speaks about sort of the borderline between the personal and the cultural and the community, and how do you navigate those boundaries between what is right for you, what is right for the community, what is right for your culture, and how do you sort of negotiate those spaces. Then Michelle's provides a very unique perspective on it. She's an organic farmer, and so she brings a perspective around the pandemic from the point of view of food security, and so she looked at the ways in which migrant workers factor into both food security, but also into this space of voicelessness, but also hero work, right? That they're sort of on the front lines. And even just recently, although it's not necessarily migrant workers, there's an outbreak again in a food processing plant. These are places where people are at risk. And so her piece really looks at that connection between who's inside a nation, who's outside a nation, where does our food come from, who are insiders, who's outsiders, and who has voices, and whose story gets to be told. My piece, I look at this, what I call a sort of like the carnivalesque, it's not my word, it's Bakhtin's, but the sort of carnivalesque atmosphere of public space now, where you have people walking around with masks, and how that kind of upends our understanding of what it means to be in the public, and what it means to be a citizen in the public, and how that's changed from being a threat or a contagion into being a responsible citizen. And so there's sort of this strange inversion that's happening in our society right now around masks. And then Olaolu's piece, he speaks to the questions of the other marginal people within our society, the ways in which these notions of interactions that we have now post in the COVID world are reminiscent of interactions that oftentimes happen between people who are visual minorities compared to people who are not in our society. So he brings in a question of identity and race and interactions in public spaces around those themes. So you can see that we've triangulated this question of masks from a variety of different perspectives, and we're only 4 people, and there's obviously way more stories out there. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first vignette author, which is Zhenyi.
Thank you, Chase. Great introduction, and actually a great review how we started and how we concluded at this stage. Yes, we had a lot of discussion on how to approach masks, and we find this is the best way that each of us we contribute our own vignette and our own thoughts on that. I'm a professor teaching intercultural communication at Rhodes, and always I start a discussion with my student, what is culture? And there are many different models on what is culture, but masks this time during the pandemic actually helped me to examine what is culture and how culture functions in our society in a quite inspiring way, because when we look at what we are wearing, actually we are wearing a lot. Human beings are probably the most curious creature, like to put many things on their body. And so when I start to wear my eyeglass, like it's okay, it's normal, like people won't prejudice me, or when people don't have eyeglasses, it's fine. But why masks become such a kind of like touchstone, suddenly separate people from different like different camps, like and opposite to each other. And that's what I started to examine and started to initiate this model, that it's not only my decision, it's actually my community will decide what is proper, what is normal, and also the nature, the mother nature, right? Because there's a virus still going on, and the mother nature at this moment pushes us to consider to put the masks on. But then when I refer to extension, is that do we have supplies? Do we have the proper device? And as you can see it right now, many new, unique, different masks are invented. And also there are people still waiting for different extensions, and like vaccine, like different ways, like social distancing. These are all the extensions. And so it's in this by viewing masks as as a symbol, like dividing us, we actually understand the push and pulls of culture more vividly. And of course, if Mother Nature removed the virus from us, there will be less people wearing masks. I'd like to pass down to Michelle.
Thanks, Zhenyi. I'm just going to pause and acknowledge where I'm zooming in from today. I'm in the unceded territory of Secwepemcúlecw, which in English is known as the Shoe Swap, near a village in Chase. Just wanted to acknowledge that this is part of the beauty of Royal Roads, is I can be living here and engage in something like this and the dialogue today. So I'm grateful to be here. So as this project was getting started, this particular image of Mexican temporary foreign workers haunted me in a way. On the surface, things looked clear. These farm workers are riding in what looks like a brand new bus. They have their appropriately physically distanced seats, and they're wearing masks. But based on my work in the food system, primarily as a small-scale organic farmer and also in leadership roles with various food systems organizations, something didn't sit right with this image. So I've gone back to my notes from April about my initial reactions to this image, and many paradoxes were emerging. One paradox speaks to how temporary foreign workers have been elevated as hero labor by the agricultural industry. And yet the hero narrative hides how temporary foreign workers are really disposable labor. And this language comes from a webinar I attended with Resma Menachem and Robin DiAngelo. And they were speaking to COVID-19 and racial embodiment. And I feel it's important to acknowledge that. And I'll speak to the disposable labor more in a moment. The strongest paradox, in my opinion, relates to how masks have helped a vulnerable population of visible minorities to be more visible. And this is seen in how regularly the media have been attending to the experiences of temporary foreign workers over the past few months. However, the mask also symbolizes the systematic silencing of a group that has no power based on the structures that are in place for temporary foreign workers. Circling back to the concept of disposable labor, just yesterday, there was a call to action issued from a group that supports migrant workers in agriculture in the Okanagan to shed light on how temporary foreign workers are confined to the farms where they work. They're being fired for leaving the farm or inviting visitors in, and they're also being repatriated because their work permit is only valid for that one farm. So these rules or policies do not apply to Canadian workers. This collaborative process with Chase, Zhenyi, and Olaolu provided the space to explore these paradoxes, look more deeply at my own privileges, and the need to continue to expose systemic racism in the food system, looking at the mask as a metaphor. And I will pass it on to Chase.
Thanks, Michelle. So I came at this from a different point of view. I took the opportunity to sort of work through, admittedly, some of maybe my own hesitations and my own worries about the pandemic. And remember that we were writing this earlier on when there wasn't the public acknowledgement from the WHO or from the BC CDC or the Canadian chief medical officer that wearing masks was recommended. So we were writing in a COVID world where masks were actually being, there was the suggestion that you shouldn't be wearing masks. You certainly shouldn't be wearing N95 masks in public. You should, because of the idea of sparsity in terms of personal protection equipment, right? So it started for me in a very personal way, and we'd gotten this opportunity, and I was thinking about masks, and I went into my local thrifties, and I saw two older people. They weren't very senior, but they were definitely senior, and I saw them with what now is like the acceptable level of precaution. They were wearing masks, they had gloves on, And in that moment, though, people were moving around them in a way that was very much like they were signaling as they were moving around this couple that they were fearful. Like the mask was a sign of the abject. The abject is this idea that Julia Kristeva has, which is that it's that which is rejected that is part of the psyche that you both reject and that you are obsessed about. So it was just sort of it's the rubbernecking moment where you kind of pass the accident and you are both fearful, but you're also curious. And so this couple was in thrifties, moving and shopping, wearing N95 masks, and people were fearful. They were looking at these people as with, I think, a similar, maybe I'm projecting, but from my point of view, they were looking at that couple from the perspective of, are they wearing the masks to protect themselves, or are they wearing the masks because they're sick and they're worried about contaminating other people? So there was this sense of contagion and of fear that came along with the mask, and early on. This sort of backed up something that I found was really interesting, because I had been following the pandemic just for my own sort of, when it started, I read the news and I was very aware of the pandemic and sort of the alarm that it was coming. It didn't take me by surprise. I had anticipated it. And so earlier, before I had seen those people in the thrifties, I had actually said we should probably purchase ourselves some N95 masks, because I'm anticipating that these masks will be gone. And in fact, they were. At that point, I was already late. If you know Victoria, it's very difficult to get anything on the island most of the time. And so I had actually reached out to my father in Alberta, and I'd said to him, hey, if you go into a hardware store, pick up a box of N95 masks, because I suspect they might be useful. He'd gone in and purchased a box, and then he'd given one to my brother and one to me, and my brother's in Alberta. My brother was like, I don't need these, and he gave them back. My dad took them back. So there wasn't the sense of the need of these as protective parts of equipment for the public in any way at that point. It was very nonchalant. And as the pandemic kind of continued, the carnivalesque sort of took over. And the carnivalesque, again, from a theoretical point of view, is this notion of that the mask and these moments of carnival allows us to speak kind of truth to power anonymously, like the jester at the court. That you can say things and you can act in certain ways with a mask, or in these moments like Halloween or Carnival, where you're yourself, but you're masked in some way. So your identity is protected, and it gives you a sense of inhibition, and it allows you to sort of speak truth to power. And what I found was really interesting, that in fact, what was happening is that there was this inversion, but it was reinscribing, it wasn't that the masks allowed us to actually kick off some of these things that Michelle and Olaolu and Zhenyi brought up, but in fact, they re-entrenched these stereotypes. They re-entrenched this fear of the other. They re-entrenched this idea. So we became this sort of weird environment, strange or uncanny environment, which was recognizable, but not normal. But it didn't shake off anything oppressive. In fact, what it did is it reinscribed those things that sort of restricted us from each other. So that was part of my investigation, is how when we're wearing our masks, we maintain, even though it gives us this, it seems to give us this freedom in other theoretics, but what it did is it maintained these deep-seated understandings of who the other was and who we should be fearful of, and who's allowed to be in public space and who's not. And then I ended my piece with this idea of the supplement, because the supplement, again, theoretically comes from from Derrida, but the supplement is this idea that every time, if you wrote a report and then you put an appendices at the end of the report, the only reason you're putting that is because it's necessary for the whole. You can't supplement something that is whole. By supplementing something, you acknowledge that it's lacking. And so the mask, in my opinion, sort of becomes this supplement to our citizenship. It becomes this supplement of caring. You can care internally, but it's when you put the mask on. Now we're in this world in which when you put the mask on, it supplements that citizenship, or it supplements an ideology, whatever it is that your perspective is. But the mask becomes an extension of, a necessary an extension of your identity in some strange way that we've never had this before. Whether you choose to believe in or not to believe in, or want to or not to want to wear a mask, it supplements, it adds to something that otherwise you imagined was whole, which is your identity. And this sort of came to light as I was walking my dogs one evening, and this elderly gentleman came towards me, and I wasn't wearing a mask, and he lifted his hand, and in his hand he had an N95 mask, and he placed the N95 mask on his face as he walked. He gave me kind of 10 feet, and then he kind of tipped his hat and said hello. And then I realized that at that moment he was looking at me like I had looked at those people in Thrifties, that there had been this inversion, that in Thrifties I had seen those people with the masks as being contagion and a threat. And now as he passes me and puts his mask on as I'm not wearing a mask, I become the threat. And so we're in these really interesting times. So that's sort of what my vignette tried to hit on. And I'll pass it over to Olaolu to wrap us up.
Thank you, Dr. Remillard. I'll give everyone just a second to read this image, as it is not just an image, it's actually a Facebook post by my friend Wes. As each of the other contributors to this chapter have spoken about, it was very important that we took on positionality even as we gave our reference or gave our narrative of what our experience with the mask has been over the course of these last few months. So I was really interested and intrigued by what the individual experiences of individuals who perhaps in a different context are seen as the visible minorities, but ironically are those who are invisible in society. And so for me, I asked this question, whether or not the mask was really for the sake of being a protector from the unseen person, or really the container for the seen individual. And that being from the perspective of that individual, those individuals who hold a hegemonic position in society. And so I was intrigued by the idea, which has been proposed by the Copenhagen School of Risk Society, and how that with securitization was then further supported in trying to paint a picture and to point out individuals who do not look like the majority. And so those other individuals we see on the West Coast, there was a lot of hate crimes and racism towards people of Asian descent. And we can look at many other pockets of the country and can see what that looks like even with other visible minority groups or BIPOC groups as well. And so I was really intrigued what was happening and whether or not this was actually bringing more attention to what really has been occurring all along, but now this was being amplified as a result of the mask. And so as my friend Wes has said here, people may have been surprised by this idea of social distancing, or be surprised by these gazes and these stares that they were receiving. But really, for a minority individual, specifically a Black minority individual, this is just a way of life. And so now, how is that individual being perceived given this new addition, as Dr. Li spoke about with the mask, given this thing that wasn't necessarily part of the norm before, but now has become part of our everyday interactions? And then I was intrigued also by this idea of, from an intercultural perspective, from an individualistic lens, people would wear a mask for the protection of themselves. From a collective lens, people would wear the mask for the sake of protecting others. Now, what does that mean in the context where you now have diaspora, I being one of them, who are living in a context where it is an individualistic society, but they are coming from a context which is collective? And how is that interwork? How is that tension internally at work in them, even as they are interacting with others in society as well. Inevitably, what we found in our discussions and our interactions is that the use of the mask is polyvalent, because at all times we have a vowel and ascription at work. And really, this was just a further reflection of the consideration of in-group and out-group dynamics at play. So for me, what this really represented was this idea of what W.E.B. Du Bois speaks of as double consciousness. How am I being perceived? How are others perceiving me? Where do I fit? Do I fit? And am I being welcomed within the societal context, or am I being shunned and pushed away? So very interesting as a point of conversation, even as some people would suggest that this pandemic has been the great equalizer for many people. And I think I found that very interesting, even as we saw fashion houses like Givenchy or YSL and all of these houses start to make their masks. And perhaps this was the advent of this being a part of our attire and this being something that was just regular. But in fact, what I have seen and continue to see is really that it has just continued to ostracize and subject certain groups of individuals to another form of hate, if you will, and racism, if you will. So it's just amplifying things that we had already had occurring prior to the pandemic. That's the end of my vignette.
Thanks, Olaolu. Now that we have shared a bit of our stories and how they intersected with the many meanings for masks during a pandemic, we would like to open it up to Q&A. As well, in the spirit of dialogue, we invite the audience to share a part of your own stories around mask wearing or not wearing and making the invisible visible. Just a few notes around process before we delve in. We will be responding to the questions that came in through the Zoom Q&A chat box. If you would like to join in the dialogue, you can do so in two ways. You can type your comments into the Zoom webinar chat box, or you can raise your hand and share your voice with us. Since this is not a private space, we can't guarantee confidentiality, so please be mindful of this as you consider what you would like to share with the group. Now to frame dialogue a bit. Dialogue is a process grounded in openness, honesty, and genuine listening, the aim of which is to gain a deeper understanding and acceptance of experiences and perspectives, both of the self and the other. Based on these principles, we invite you to speak to your own understanding and experiences as you join in this dialogue.
So Michelle, there was a question that came in first in the Q&A, and then there was a comment in the chat from Annie. So the one in the Q&A, I just briefly answered, said that we'd get to it when we got to the open space, but it reads, do each of you currently wear masks in public? And if so, in what situations? Also, what style do you prefer, or what do they look like?
Great question. Is that one that each of us wants to respond to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, do you want to? I actually, for this, started to wear a mask, the N95 mask, right when we first started to do this project, to see what it was like. And since that time, I've moved to the like either like my wife has made a couple or purchased a couple of the cloth masks, and now I have some of the disposable ones I bought just the other day at Home Depot. And I don't wear them all the time. I wear them when I go into a situation where I think that I won't be able to properly social distance. So if I go into a grocery store, or if I go into a merchant, I don't wear them when I'm walking or riding my bike. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I'm very similar to that. I also, I live rurally, so I live on a farm, and I'm actually not in public spaces very much. And so I'm not wearing a mask very often. I will wear them when I'm in enclosed spaces. In spaces where it's harder to have that physical distancing. And I have an array of fabric masks that are quite lovely. So a friend made a bunch for our farm crew, and then my sister also made one for me and my daughter. And so those are the ones that I'm wearing. Zhenyi?
Oh, sure. Well, as I am a Chinese, it's actually a more difficult question whether I should put masks on or not, because I can be targeted in either way. That and not many people are familiar with where Wuhan is and where I'm from, and of course they don't know how many years I've been already away from China, but I look like a Chinese and I look very much suspicious. If I put a mask on, probably I already carry the virus. But if I don't, probably I'm still carrying the virus. And so people keep automatic social distancing from me anyway. You know, mask is a really difficult decision. I was also thinking like one day I should put some, use a marker to put the words here, like I'm clean or something, like when I'm wearing it or something like that. And in our chapter writing, I also shared with my co-authors that wearing something can be used for two different purposes, but then can just manifest in the same way. There's a classic research on Sony Walkman, why people put the ear pieces on. Some just don't want to be disturbed. Some just don't want to disturb the other people, but both of them, they put it on. Same thing for masks. So I know my difficulty, I know my struggle, my hesitation. So whenever I see the other people wearing or not wearing masks, I can be very much empathetic to these people, especially if they appear like look like come from Asia and then later come from Italy, Spain, and because this becomes a global pandemic, and it's kind of different groups othering the others, and exactly like Olaolu pointed here, it's a visual expression, and I kept on thinking why masks bother so much. Like as I said, we put eyeglasses on, it's okay, right? We put this on, you have earrings, you have many things on your face, but it's mask. It's so interesting. That's why we put this chapter on, invite everyone to think further on this. Olaolu.
I wear a mask only when I go to see my barber, actually. So I do have I have multiple disposable masks hanging from my rearview mirror in the event that certain rooms or certain spaces, stores ask and request you to wear one. I think the only other time aside from seeing my barber that I've worn one is when I went to see my optometrist. And so I have one, but I do not wear one on a day-to-day basis by any means. And I haven't invested in one of cloth fabric. Perhaps that's another reason why I haven't actually put one on, because I haven't found one to match my attire. But regardless, no, I think being respectful, as Dr. Li has spoken about, it's interesting. And that was part of what my vignette was speaking to. Am I doing this for me or am I doing this for others? And so just being aware, if I was in a place where there were elderly individuals or people who were at risk, I would definitely wear a mask. Or if I was in a place where I felt as if there was the potential that I could contaminate another individual because of the lack of spaces Dr. Remillard has spoken to, then I would. But it's not, at this point, a part of my everyday practice.
So there's a couple of follow-ups here, and then we'll take a couple of the ones that came up in the chat. There's a few that have come up, and but there are a few in here that are related to wearing masks. Ron says that, you know, his daughter is high risk, and from the beginning of the pandemic, that he's used his workshop masks to start off, and then now cloth masks when he's inside, and especially if the people in the establishment are wearing masks. And then Barbara writes, you know, will you be expanding upon this via social media? Part of the culture should include methodology: sanitize hands, place mask on, sanitize again, don't touch the mask or the face afterwards. And I say this because I'm high risk, and the house I live in is for sale, and people enter with the gloves and the mask, but they keep touching their face and their mask, right? So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of literacy, you know, from a point of view of professional communications, there's a lot of literacy that needs to happen around proper usage. It's not just the usage of it, it's the proper usage. And I think, I mean, none of us are medical professionals, and we were just like regular citizens in that sense. And our focus is really on the cultural things. You know, I think what Ron said is interesting, is that when you see people wearing masks, and Zhenyi said that as well, when you see people wearing masks, you're more likely to want to wear a mask. And I feel like there's a tipping point. I would predict that there's going to be a tipping point at some point where all of a sudden not wearing a mask becomes the outlier. And we're not there yet, I don't think. You know, I think we're at that point right now where we're kind of in that sort of 30 to 70%, where, depending on the context, we're not sure, but at some point it'll become a social norm, and then it'll become almost offensive not to wear a mask. And I think you can start to see that in certain places where the outbreak is more severe. And we're fortunate here, and for us that are on Vancouver Island and in BC in general, that we're not in a high place, a high risk place right now. But I think those things can change very, very quickly. There's a lot of stuff that came in here, so I want to try to get to everyone's. So I'm just looking in the chat here, and I think the next one came up from Annie. She writes, to add to this idea that masks are contributing to othering, I also find that ideologies also plays a part in the heightening tensions between mask wearers and non-mask wearers in the context of cultures. There seems to be a debate on whether the mask represents oppression on people's civil liberties. You find this more in Western countries where civil liberties are highly upheld, and the tension everyone is feeling is being directed to those who do wear masks, especially those who are visibly racial minorities, seeing and hearing these anecdotally through the US. Arguments made for wearing masks are now attributed to socialist movements or being sheeple or contributing to the stripping of rights, although a lot of mask wearers are wearing masks perhaps because of the understanding of collectivist culture. I think I'll defer this to maybe Zhenyi and Olaolu and Michelle. You know, I think there is ideologies at play, and I think your vignettes speak to those much more than mine do. So I'll let you respond to Annie's points there.
I would start by, first off, thank you, Annie, for those thoughts. I think there are definitely a lot of elements of what you've said that we considered even in our conversations. And that discussion of civil liberties is one which is very important. And actually what initially motivated me to take this angle of looking at it from an intercultural perspective was thinking about the difference of what lockdown looked in each country. And actually, the World Economic Forum did this short, I would say maybe 90 seconds, 2-minute clip that showed how different lockdown looked, say, in Saudi Arabia versus Spain versus Singapore and so on and so forth. And what that in itself started to show me was that even the way people were wearing masks in said country was actually very reflective of how that particular government or those people in that country as a whole had tended to approach the pandemic. And so, yes, very interesting. You find more times than not the people who are contesting, or the states in which the majority of individuals tend to feel as though they want to voice some sort of discontent with this, is the place where people have been given the liberty to share their voice. And so this becomes an infringement on rights, if you will. And so the question, just like Dr. Li spoke about, even with the Walkman, is I'm wearing headphones, and am I doing it because I'm trying to be respectful rather of you, or am I doing it more because I want to have enhanced sound myself? And so there's always this, each of these vignettes, each of these discussions, is always a dichotomy at play. And I would agree with you that yes, it's very interesting, because to that end, it then becomes another point of conversation when we look at it from an intersectional perspective and see how it impacts a different pocket of the population, others, BIPOCs, people, minorities. Then we even look from a gender lens, how does that affect different people as well? So these are very important considerations and part of our discussion.
Well, I will add here that we are probably witnessing birth of a new norm, new normal, and although it's not a pleasant experience, but this probably is the time. Like we went to Hawaii, then we were told there's a new island that would be born in 1,000 years, and because it's forming under the sea, like so far we don't see it, but the volcanoes building it, and wearing masks or as a normal, or as a, like what I propose, a super normal, where you actually don't have any prejudice anymore on wearing it. It may take years, may take many years, or may not really happen, but we are experiencing it. And as researchers, as practitioners, as scholars, this is one of the rare opportunity actually to see it forming and deforming, reforming in different nations, particularly in this pandemic, that this is not 300 years ago. This is not 1,000 years ago. This is a time, first of all, we have much faster media. And second of all, we live in the community, not necessarily where we were born. And we connect to the communities, not necessarily where we are living. And all through these high-speed media, and it's more complicated than our theories, our current theories can explain. And that's why when Chase invited us to join his team to work on this chapter, we felt yeah, it's quite exciting, and we shall put it up as a record. And probably, let's say 20 years later, 100 years later, when people read our chapter, they can relate to what was happening in, I would say, if this 2020 is a divide in our civilization, probably, and then, like we are getting so used to Zoom meeting, and I will say, okay, I'm going to another Zoom room. Like, this is not the language we had before, right? But people will just say, okay, see you in another Zoom. Like, it kind of becomes like a normal. And how fast a new normal can become a normal and become a super normal, we don't know, but we are witnessing it, right? We are witnessing it. And I will invite also us to review, how a normal was built and how many people were resistant on that. And then how people will also very much resistant to give it up. In the Chinese history, when Manchu nation conquered the mainland, they forced people to have the pigtail, the so-called pigtail, the hairband like behind of the for all the men, and a lot of ethnic like Han people and other ethnicities, like they resist to change their hairstyle. And so that time they say, okay, either you change your hairstyle or you will lose your head. And many people lost their life because they resist, like they don't think it's normal, they don't think they shall do that. But after 297 years ruling, almost all the Chinese people acknowledge that's the normal. And so they, like a man with a pigtail is normal. And then the nationalists like had a revolution and then said, forget about that. And either you want to your head, or you have to give up your pigtail. And at that time, many people also lost their life. Like they said, no, it's normal, like for a man to have that. And so it's, because people don't live across 300 years, so they don't know. So that's why I think at this moment we shall record this, where we are struggling whether we are going to put masks on or not. Let's put these down and let's record it. Let's record those struggles. Let's record those debates, discussions. And for what? For 100 years later, when probably that time all the human beings are wearing masks or born with masks or something like that, and then they read that and say, wow, yeah, like this, and I saw a very interesting cartoon, like say, Grandpa, tell me about pandemic, tell me about COVID, right? And that time becomes, an epic or something. So we are experiencing it. And what I want to emphasize here is that catch the moment. Like this is the moment we can do our research. Don't wait for 50 years and say, okay, when it's in the museum, let's study on it. We are experiencing it. We are witnessing it. And that's why we put our lifestyle, life stories into our research. And I think it's very much valuable. And that's an open invitation also to the audience.
So I saw that someone's hand went up, and I believe it was Junao. Did you? I don't think I can bring you on mic, but Alana can put you on mic if you wanted to say something.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yep.
Apologies if you hear some binging, I'm still at work. Like that. I am a MAPC graduate from 2014, and it's really interesting to watch all the social media and the commentary from a whole wide variety of folks on those channels over what motivates them to wear masks and what motivates them to oppose it. Luckily with my case, it's a little less on the opposed, but there's so much personal context. Like there's so many of us with the knowledge of our family of origin, and there's, immunocompromised folks or friends with kids who have just gone into remission, and we know the risks and we know what the data and the science says, but trying to turn that into our own narratives in a way to advocate for that has been really, really challenging. So it would be really interesting just to see what strategies work for some folks in trying to put these messages out into the universe now to try to help flatten the curve and try to encourage masks as a positive thing and to try to help normalize it.
Yeah, and I think that's what Zhenyi is sort of speaking to, is that idea of normalization.
Yeah. I work in a post-secondary library, and we've had to move everything, of course, online, like a number of schools are. We talk about our experiences watching students wearing masks ahead of the closure, And from a North American perspective, we're not used to this. And so you notice that there'd be some students that would be pointing or whispering or just giving a wide berth to whoever was wearing a mask. But look at how we've evolved as a society in the last few months. Now this is looking like it's going to be a normalized thing for the entire world. So really interesting to see how things are communicated and how that stigma has evolved, and what we can do to help maybe support folks as they go back to work and try to make it a little bit easier transition.
Mm-hmm. It is. It's I mean, we're all living through it, so we don't even know, right? And these things come up, and I think that just is just a truth of our time right now, is that we don't know. We're on the tip of a wave, right? We're storm chasing right now in a way. You know, it's these things we don't know how they're going to impact us. We don't know how they're going to be taken up. We don't know how they're going to be normalized. We don't know whether or not the vaccine will work. I mean, there's a great amount of uncertainty right now for us. And I think one of the ways in which that uncertainty plays out is that people in uncertainty tend to, Olaolu brought up like the society of risk, right? But the people in risk and uncertainty, they tend to bear down on those things that they can control, right? And they bear down on those things, those beliefs that they sort of at the bedrock, right? So I think that's maybe where a lot of it might be part of the resistance around the idea of free speech or you know, citizens' right to wear or not to wear a mask comes down, is that in situations of uncertainty, we want to reduce uncertainty by going back to the basics, by doubling down on those things that we believe to be true. And so I think part of that, right, is that the uncertainty of how much COVID will take away from us, and the uncertainty of that maybe factors into the belief that civil liberties will be impinged upon because of it. So, you know, these are really interesting and complicated things, and I really appreciate you coming on mic and sharing them with us.
Thanks for the great presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome. I just wanted to go to the next. We're trying to work through here. And I saw someone else's hand came up, Michelle, so we'll try to get to you too. But so this came in from Suzanne, and it's a question for Olaolu. I'm not sure if you see it in the chat there, Olaolu, but I'll read it. It says, I'm teaching public images of justice and fairness for RRU. Cool course. As such, in reference to Olaolu's comment on polyvalence, I wonder if you could comment on tout-valence society, I don't know if I'm saying that correct, wherein people and police are recording one another, resulting in both being surveilled and surveilled when wearing masks. Mask usage and non-usage has resulted in coined terms such as mask hole. So this sort of, again, who's looking at whom in this new pandemic reality that we're living.
Yeah, very interesting, because that term mask hole I shared with our group about maybe 3 days ago, because I think it was the New Yorker had published something where they had come up with or shared new terminology that had come within this pandemic. But speaking to your idea of sous-surveillance, really it's interesting, because we always have to ask, when we're talking about a group or an individual being surveyed, who is the one in the position of power to then determine that they should be surveyed? Now, oftentimes we talk about surveillance within the context of an individual being suspicious or being needing to be surveyed because they are a threat. And so I think even unpacking that from a socio-cultural perspective, and even looking at it more in terms of who hold the positions of power, that then shifts a greater understanding of why surveillance even occurs in the first place. So whether we start to survey each other because we're wearing masks or not, that will be top down, and that will determine who is in that position at the top. Whether or not we start to survey if people should be able to walk on freely, that will also somehow be top down, and that will be a conversation of what we as a society determine is to be of greatest importance. And even when we talk about surveillance, inevitably the hope of those people who are creating this paradigm or this dynamic where there are those being surveyed is that we inevitably, we being the citizens or civil society, the public sphere will survey ourselves. And so it becomes about social pressure as much as it does about the actual policing, if you will, of actions. So I hope that's answered your question. If not, please comment for it.
Yeah, we'll wait to see if another comment comes in. But in the meantime, just reading another comment here from Janice, and she writes, "My experience has allowed me to enhance other communication opportunities. For example, I am much more aware of other ways I can connect with people with my eyes, waving to people, and being more cognizant of the value of those as the choices I have to interact with now. I saw two friends, and the only way they knew it was me and I them was by the sound of our voices. I'm very glad that I can speak and that I can hear and see as well." And again, you know, our interactions are changing. How we come and interact with each other is changing. And then Soleo writes, "Interesting presentation and viewpoints. Initially, the masking looked like one is contagion and people look at you differently, especially if you are a visible minority. Gradually, wearing a mask became part of our identity, our image, our health, and our daily life. Now the new normal mask is now a fashion statement, and you want your mask to match what you are wearing. More interestingly, in a collaborative culture or in a social life of people of African descent, the mask has been taken to a different level in terms of wearing masks in communal ceremonies like weddings and funerals. The question is, how sustainable would the wearing of masks be, bearing in mind that it's sometimes difficult to breathe under a mask in hot weather?" And then this one I thought would be a good one for you, Michelle. It is a question that says, "I'm in Richland, Washington, and we're in a high-risk area and stuck in phase 1 of reopening. We've been in isolation for 5 months. It was recently legislated to wear a mask, and a lack of consistent media agenda based on environment and health science has resulted in resistance. There is little public trust as it is not the law many were protesting. Now is a state mandate. We have seen people removed from businesses after refusing to wear a mask. We have several of your ideas converging here. We are an industrial community used to wearing safety gear and yet have resistance to the mask. We have nuclear and chemical risks that mimic COVID with symptoms showing up later. We are the breadbasket for produce for the US with a lot of migrant labor. Low-income workers are Hispanic, but US nationality. In Kelowna, migrant workers are Hispanic, but Mexican nationality. It is much easier for Mexicans to work in Canada. I've been pondering all these issues. Low-income workers here are classified as primary services." So I'd like to maybe have you, Michelle, kind of speak a little bit more about your perspective on that and the kind of convergence that it's Michelle has brought. I saw Michelle's hand go up. Maybe I should. Michelle, do you want to come on mic and give that further elaboration?
Sure, Chase. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I feel like I've largely been alone in all of these issues until today. I feel like I'm much more a part of a community. Thank you very much. I've been pondering each of your topics regarding the mask. And this is, first of all, Richland, Washington is a very interesting part of the United States where there's a lot of the waste from the Cold Wars and World War II here when it comes to nuclear and chemical. So that's basically been the primary industry. And then subsequently, the industry of fruit and food production happens here. And we have some serious environmental contamination issues. So, you know, Michelle, when you were talking about who has the power for these vulnerable populations. You know, when I saw the bus, that is certainly not what that looks like here. And as a matter of fact, human rights violations for migrant workers that are Hispanic, U.S. Hispanic citizens are big issues. But I've had to really focus because a lot of these issues are quite overwhelming. My husband does work on site, and I was supposed to be contracted by the same site until COVID hit. So COVID wiped out my job. But we have been working on, he's a manager of environment and sustainability. We've been working on messaging that overcomes some of the resistance that we're seeing. So, you know, in the US, we've had a largely politicized media agenda regarding the mask. And even in our industrial construction and risky environment of nuclear and chemical waste, we have people resisting it because they feel it's a human rights issue. So we've largely tried to pull this back down to cultural values, what we all as a community value. And we're looking at communication strategies like inoculation theory, and how do we move the needle on social judgment theory and that latitude of acceptance to get people to use the mask. Now, the mask has a long history when it comes to medical use as a protectionary, cautionary device, but there is absolutely no guarantee with what we don't know about COVID that is going to work. But where our focus in communications is largely on what can you control. And you can only control your behavior, but yet your behavior also inspires and motivates other people. So wearing the mask here has been, since June 22nd, it has been a state mandate. And we're seeing a lot of rioting and things going on in our state. But we now see that people are starting to enforce the mask, but we went through a phase of almost 2 months where the mask was thought of as an othering, that you are sick and you're diseased. Certainly people of race, when you count the numbers, a lot of the minorities were the last ones to adopt the mask. We're not really sure why. But our focus is largely on where are those resistances, trying to understand why those resistances are happening, and then trying to work on persuasion and persuading individual behavior based on cultural values. And that is the health and safety of everyone, but it is a big uphill task. So even myself, I drive with an Alberta plate here because we were relocated here right before COVID. And so I haven't been able to get back across the border. I have an L visa, which means that, you know, according to the new political agenda of the United States, I will probably not get my work permit approved here for years after COVID. And getting into the United States to do any work, for example, is completely blocked. And anybody who leaves even with a work visa and a job here will not get back into the country. So there's just many issues. But like I said, just to recap, we're focusing on what people can control themselves when it comes to communications.
Yeah, it's very complex and needs a combination of approaches. There are some structural mandates coming in Canada, like Calgary is bringing in wearing masks August 1st. I think Edmonton is considering it. So that level of intervention is starting. One of the questions I asked in the vignette I submitted for this chapter was around, you know, who is ensuring that temporary foreign workers have access to PPEs or masks. Part of this call for action yesterday out of the Okanagan was that the temporary foreign workers can't even leave their farms. So they can't leave to get groceries or go to church or do these things to look after themselves. So what is needed at that point to create shifts? And so the call out for that was multi-level as well, like contacting different levels of government, the farms directly. There were farms named that are engaging in these practices, and also trying to provide what's needed. Part of the problem is the housing situation. It tends to be quite cramped, and the physical distancing isn't there, which increases risk. So there's so many layers to it, and it's sort of looking at each of them and where the communications need to be directed.
Mm-hmm. We were completely without any masks, and our grocery stores emptied out here for weeks. Like, it was very difficult to get food, but we didn't hear anything in the media as to how that was affecting the farm labor. But many of them that we see when you drive through the communities, I mean, we are basically locked down. We're stuck in phase 1 of reopening, which means that, you know, we're expected to isolate. But you go to the farming communities or drive through, and you see that the farm workers aren't wearing any protective gear. And we've seen their housing here, and it's quite challenging. It is, as you said, Michelle, it is impossible for them to isolate. We have 3 counties, Benton, Walla Walla, and Yakima, and we're all stuck in phase 1. And this is where there is a heavy concentration of migrants, and they are being blamed for bringing in this disease, when the disease actually came from Seattle to our community in our retired population. The retired population of high income housing in Seattle have retired to this area because it's very much like Arizona, and that's why it's such a hot pot for produce. They basically retired and retreated here, bringing the disease with them, not the migrant workers. But there is that perception that they are the cause of this disease, and that's not helping us with any of our communications. So,
Yeah, it's such a layered issue and conversation, and I'm also mindful of time, and it would be great to find a way to continue conversations and respond to some of the chat posts and question and answer, and maybe that's something that the 4 of us can respond to and then send out by email to everyone who is here today. Yeah, because there's just so much to.
I think that there is one, Michelle, sorry, I think there's one question that I'd like to address, and it's something that we haven't addressed in our vignettes, but I think it's an important one. And it's a slightly different theme than we've been talking about, and it's from Sandra. She writes, I was interested to hear the reflections on racism and want to add a vignette on sexism because there has not been one already mentioned. While grocery shopping during the seniors hour on the weekend, as I am an older woman wearing a mask, I was addressed by a man younger and larger than myself who was not wearing a mask. His first comment was that I was too beautiful to wear a mask. His next comment was that I should not have to live in fear of COVID because the facts show most deaths have occurred in long-term care. Assessing the situation, I tried to deflect his comments and move away, but the man moved quickly into my personal space to continue his spiel. I suspected that he would not have tried to engage in this way had I been a man and wanted to exploit the opportunity. And so maybe Michelle or Olaolu, do you want to speak to that? We don't, hey, Susan, you want to write that vignette? And I don't know if we have time to get it into the chapter, but yeah, I mean, there's so many different avenues to this, but definitely sexism is one of them that we admittedly don't address very openly in this. We do address it in some ways in terms of marginality, but we don't talk about it in terms of explicit content. So I'll turn it over to Olaolu or Michelle's, who I think speak to marginality a little bit more than mine and Zhenyi's, to see what their point of view is on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sandra, for your point and your question. I think I don't think it is a valid one. And I think even as we speak about, each of us took a positionality based on our own experience. So when I was speaking to racism or speaking to any form of feeling othered, I was speaking to it based on my experience. Now, in saying that, one consideration which I've included in our vignette was the importance for intersectionality. And this is an idea that has been cited many times, which Crenshaw proposed in the 80s. And that's the importance that when we come to the table, we're not only looking at an individual based on their race, but we're also considering their gender, we're considering their age, we're considering all of these other factors that come together as well. So I think taking that into consideration, even in line with what we are saying, you know, we did this as a collaborative autoethnographic approach because we wanted to highlight the importance of taking a lens or taking a perspective of somebody other than yourself. And so in the same way that Dr. Remillard has invited you to compose a vignette to add to our submission as well, that's really what the idea is. And even as we go to our next and final section and we talk about the considerations, really what we're doing is we're trying to open the dialogue and to create a space where people are considering these alternate experiences. I'll give it to Michelle. Maybe she can add to that as well.
Yeah, this sort of connects with Chase's comment earlier about the mask in the pandemic is entrenching some of the things that have already been here and present, and it seems to be an entry point for this man to engage in these behaviors, which are invasive and gendered and not respectful. So the masks definitely allow the unwanted, nasty parts of our culture and society to be there. So, yeah.
I think just in terms of time, Michelle, maybe we should move to considerations and Alana has suggested that she might be able to coordinate a follow-up for the folks who we didn't have a chance to address their questions or their stories today, and that we'd be able to maybe connect more on an individual level. So I'll let Alana kind of coordinate that. But maybe let's move on to that last point of the considerations and then wrap up so we're on time.
Mm-hmm.
So here, as Dr. Remillard spoke about with our process, our intention wasn't to give something that was conclusive. You know, this has been, even if you can look at what we've done today as really reflective of what our hopes are, and that is to create and catalyze further discussion and thought on what the impact of this experience is for each individual. So our first consideration speaks about the mask being opaque and really being a muzzle. So to that end, we talk about the mask silencing the voices of those perhaps who are giving, in the case of Michelle's vignette, are giving the help and services to those of us who are reliant on it for our sustenance, for our nutrition, and so on and so forth. To consider the mask in our second consideration as translucent, we talk about it from a place of maybe how it is put us into the state where we're sedated. And in that, because we are in this new normal and trying to figure out what is normal and how to function in this in-between, we perhaps are somehow in this place that we don't have answers, and there's questions that continue to arise, and perhaps that catalyzes how we're acting and responding in this time as well. Finally, our final consideration with parent, this really touches on how maybe this is more of a reflection of what, and so even as a last question that Sandra asked spoke to this experience that she had at the grocery store, this isn't a new experience by any means. Maybe it's amplified now as a result of the mask, but once again, as each of our vignettes point to, what we're doing is we're just shedding light on something that perhaps the black light now becomes more apparent, and it was already there in plain, or it was there before, but we didn't see it in plain sight, and so now amplified it in a new way. But I think what's most important, even as we think about this mask, is really talking about this simultaneous disruption and also a definition of what life is and what the new normal will be, because as it stands right now, nobody knows, and things are continuing to evolve. So we believe that our hope is that you will embrace these different perspectives, that you will uncover the ones that we haven't spoken about as we've initiated with our conversation today, that you'll look to connect with people who have different experiences, and more importantly, we will unlearn our biases through that process of interaction with each other as well.
So if you are interested, the publication has yet to be put out. But we get confirmation of the publisher and the date and so on, we'll make that available to you via Alana because she has your registration. But it'll be likely titled something like Pandemic Rhetoric, and the two editors are Douglas Vaycock and John Pollock. So
Well, also as the school director, I like to welcome the audience. For those already registered and studying in our program. Really nice to see you here, and this is also a new way to connect with you when you're not on campus, and neither as we are. And for those who are not familiar with our programs, we have undergraduate level BA in Professional Communication. That's a completion program. You can complete your degree in a year or in 2 years, depends on your preference. And we also have graduate certificates embedded into our graduate degree programs, in 2 MA degree programs, one for professional communication, one for intercultural and international communication. And they are offered online. Also, we have the on-campus option. Of course, nowadays we do that remotely. You can ask Helena for more information about these programs.
Thank you. Yes, so if you are looking for more information about the programs, you can get in touch with myself. I have been sending you all emails, so you already have my email. I will be sending out another one with the follow-up of the recording. But you can also get in touch with our enrollment advisor. So if you are interested in one of the programs, you want to find out more, please get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you more. You can watch one of our program-specific webinars that go through the programs, all sorts of information available to you. I also wanted to mention that we have been offering online learning for 25 years. I think that that's something right now, as many institutions are transferring to online, we feel very proud of the fact that we have been perfecting this for such a long time. So definitely something to look more into if you are considering education right now. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. So this was an incredible, I love the autoethnography perspective of just weaving in all these different perspectives of such a complex issue. And, as we booked this webinar, this was something, we already recognized that it was complex, but at the weeks that led up to this time, it was amping up considerably. So we're grateful to all of you who joined us today live, who asked your questions, who shared your stories. There's a lot of bravery in that as well. And all of you who will be watching the recording, as we mentioned, we'd love to hear from you. If we didn't get to your specific question, unfortunately, time is limited, but you can reach out to me. I'm happy to get you in touch with the faculty and continue these conversations. This is a place to build community and know that these thoughts you've been having, you're not alone in. Many of us have been digging into these ideas and wondering what they mean and where we're going. So with that, we're going to end, but I want to give a special thanks to Zhenyi, to Chaseten, to Olaolu, and to Michelle. Thank you so much for putting this all together. And thank you to everyone who is on the back end of this webinar who supported the technology and the chat box. So we hope you all have a great day, and we hope that we get to stay in contact with you going forward. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.